Comment down below where you're watching from and don't forget to like and subscribe if you hate Karen. That's how I, Ethan Carter, kicked off my video. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine I'd be posting a story about nuclear revenge in my quiet suburban cul-de-sac, yet here I am, about to recount the day I accidentally made a Karen homeless. It all started on a Saturday, a day that, in any ordinary suburb, should have been as predictable as the rising sun. I was busy with one of my weekly rituals, washing my car. Yes, I know, a black car in summer is a challenge, but I've always prided myself on keeping my ride spotless. Armed with a trusty bucket, generous soap, and a playlist of classic soul, I turned my modest driveway into my personal car spa. The day was picture perfect, the sun was shining, birds provided a cheerful background, and, for a moment, life was serene. But serenity was short-lived. Earlier that week, I'd received nothing more than a chilly side-eye from one of my neighbors for simply breathing a bit too loudly. I shrugged it off, until today. While I was diligently scrubbing away the week's grime, I noticed movement on the opposite porch. There, standing as if to command respect from the very air itself, was Caroline Westwood, the infamous head of the HOA and the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer. In our community, she was known simply as Karen. Caroline, or Karen, had that look, perfectly coiffed platinum blonde hair, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, and an expression that could curdle fresh milk. Today, she was watching intently from her immaculate porch, where even her chihuahua, dubbed Princess Paws, seemed to tremble with anxiety. I offered a polite wave, expecting the usual curt acknowledgement. Instead, her icy glare made it clear, I had crossed an invisible line. I didn't know it then, but that single moment was only the spark. The neat facade of Pleasantview was about to shatter. As I continued to work on my car, my mind buzzed with the underlying question, why did a simple act of washing my car, my means of taking care of my property, trigger such scorn? I suspected it wasn't just about cleanliness but a deep, obsessive need on her part to control every inch of our neighborhood. Even as I dried my car, I felt the weight of her disapproval seeping into the day. I wondered if this confrontation would be remembered as a minor suburban spat or if it would spiral into something much larger, a public showdown between individual rights and the oppressive power of the HOA's self-appointed enforcer. Little did I know, the day was still young, and the seeds of a full-blown neighborhood drama had been sown. As I wrapped up my car wash, my thoughts churned with both annoyance and a mounting resolve. That Saturday, Pleasantview would change forever. And I, Ethan Carter, was about to find out just how deep the rabbit hole went. Part 2, almost equals 700 words, setting the stage and the escalation begins the following morning. I awoke feeling unsettled by the events of Saturday. My usually untroubled routine in Pleasantview had been marred by one intense encounter. Over breakfast, my wife Samantha Carter asked, "Ethan, you seem off today. What's on your mind?" I hesitated only a moment before recounting the incident, the way I had been peacefully washing my car when the notorious Karen, Caroline Westwood, had appeared like a storm cloud on her porch, her eyes narrowed in silent condemnation. I explained how, as I rinsed the suds off my car and admired the gleaming surface under the bright morning sun, I suddenly caught sight of Caroline standing on her front porch. Clad in impeccably coordinated attire, with designer sunglasses shielding her eyes and her chihuahua, Princess Paws, nestled uncomfortably in her arms, she exuded an aura of authority. Her expression was unyielding, a silent but unmistakable challenge to my very right to enjoy my morning routine. Samantha frowned. "You really think she's that obsessed with rules?" she asked. I replied, "In Pleasantview, every blade of grass, every detail, is scrutinized by her. She's the head of the HOA, and she takes it upon herself to police the neighborhood." While most residents might have tolerated her minor infractions, I could sense that Caroline wasn't content with small grievances. She saw every ordinary act as a potential violation of her strict standards. Determined to regain a sense of control, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to observe the environment. The streets of Pleasantview looked picture perfect. Lawns trimmed to perfection, houses freshly painted, and neighbors exchanging polite nods. Yet, beneath that immaculate veneer, I noticed an undercurrent of tension. People seemed a bit too careful, their conversations laced with subdued hints of frustration over someone or something. Whispers of "Karen" drifted in the air like a secret code among residents who, despite their outward calm, were weary of Caroline's relentless surveillance. As I strolled past a row of houses, I recalled a conversation with Mr. Henderson, an elderly gentleman who had lived here for decades. He had confided in me that in Pleasantview, no one escapes the watchful eyes of the HOA's enforcer. "She has a knack for zeroing in on even the smallest misstep," he had said. Those words echoed in my mind, adding a layer of solemnity to my morning walk. By the time I returned home, a simmering resolve had taken hold of me. I couldn't shake the thought that my very act of washing my car, a simple, routine maintenance task, had become a battleground in a warped enforcement of suburban standards. I sat down at my desk and began to jot down every detail I could remember, the exact time, the way the sunlight danced off the wet surface of my car, and, most importantly, the cold, disapproving stare of Caroline Westwood. I even scrawled a note about the vague threats I had overheard from a couple of neighbors who whispered about monitoring and community standards. Determined that I would not let fear govern my life, I also started researching my rights as a homeowner. I pored over local ordinances and HOA guidelines, and it became increasingly clear that I was well within my rights to maintain my property as I saw fit. There was nothing in the rules that said a resident could be harassed for washing their car or for letting a little imperfection show on their lawn. In fact, the ordinances seemed to champion individual freedom, even as they were twisted by those like Caroline to serve an agenda of control. That evening, as dusk settled softly over Pleasantview and I sat with Samantha on our back porch, I felt a mixture of indignation and quiet determination. The events of that day had awakened in me a resolve to stand up for my rights, and, perhaps, for the rights of all the other residents who had grown tired of the constant, microscopic scrutiny. I promised myself that I would not let one person's obsessive enforcement of meaningless rules rob me of my peace. In that moment, I decided that the coming days would be spent documenting every encounter, preparing for any further attempts at interference, and, if necessary, taking a stand at the next HOA meeting. Little did I know that the simple act of washing my car would set off a chain reaction that would forever alter the balance of power in Pleasantview. Part 3, almost equals 700 words. The confrontation escalates and police intervention. It wasn't long after that reflective evening that the inevitable happened. One bright Saturday morning, still riding the wave of my newfound determination, I was in my driveway finishing up the remnants of my car wash when I heard the distinct sound of tires screeching. I looked up, and there she was. Caroline Westwood, unmistakable in her role as the HOA enforcer, arrived in a pristine white SUV. But today, her vehicle seemed to shout defiance rather than standard order. The window rolled down, and with a scowl that could curdle milk, she stepped out. Ethan, she barked, her voice laced with disdain as she glared at me. "I've told you before about your lawn. It's a disgrace. And now you're just standing there flaunting it like it's a badge of honor. This is a clear violation of Section 3, subsection B, paragraph 12 of the HOA agreement." I attempted to defuse the situation, offering a measured reply. "Caroline, it's Saturday. Can't we just enjoy the sunshine? I've just finished mowing. There's no need for all this." But her response was immediate and unyielding. "I've already called the authorities." I raised an eyebrow incredulously. The mere thought that someone would dial 911 because I was standing on my own property over a lawn disagreement was absurd. Nevertheless, I couldn't help but record this moment on my phone, even if just to preserve the evidence of the absurdity unfolding before me. Within minutes, the familiar sound of sirens announced the arrival of law enforcement. A patrol car, its lights flashing, pulled up. Out stepped a young officer with a cautious but curious demeanor, Officer Mitchell, fresh-faced and perhaps overwhelmed by the suburban circus that had formed. He approached Caroline first, asking in a gentle tone, "Ma'am, we've received a call regarding a lawn violation. Could you explain what's going on?" Caroline's response was theatrical. With a polished finger pointed directly at me, she declared, "That man is in blatant violation of HO regulations. His lawn is unkempt, and he's doing nothing to fix it. I'm tired of seeing this disgrace." Officer Mitchell, clearly trying to balance professionalism with incredulity, turned to me. "Sir, may I see some form of identification?" I reached into my back pocket and produced my wallet. With the prompt flip of its contents, revealing my police badge, I felt a slight victory pulse through me as Officer Mitchell's eyes widened in recognition. "Ma'am, this is Chief Carter," he stated firmly. At that moment, the situation became surreal. Caroline's face, already a study in self-righteousness, began a rapid transformation. Her expression changed from fierce indignation to shock and confusion. "Chief," she squeaked, her voice coming out several octaves higher than usual. The assembled officers exchanged glances, their smirks betraying amusement at the unfolding drama. Officer Mitchell, regaining his composure, addressed Caroline in a measured tone. "Ma'am, while we respect your concern for community standards, calling 911 over a minor matter like this is a misuse of emergency services," he explained. "We're here to ensure that all residents are treated fairly." Caroline continued to rant, her words growing more outlandish by the minute. She insisted that my apparently aggressive behavior was endangering the community and that her 911 call was justified because my actions were in violation of some intricate HOA clause. I could only maintain a calm demeanor, knowing that the evidence I had, my voice recording, the clear recording of her tirade, would later speak for itself. After a tense standoff that felt both absurd and deeply maddening, Officer Mitchell finally informed us, "We will file this as a false alarm, but let it be noted that misuse of police services is taken seriously." He then checked his notepad for details and led Caroline back to her SUV, instructing her on the proper use of emergency calls. I watched, both amused and exasperated, as she muttered threats of further complaints. Once the patrol car departed, I couldn't help but smile bitterly. The absurdity was overwhelming. Here I was, simply enjoying a car wash on my own property, while an overzealous enforcer of HOA rules used the police to try to control me. I knew then that this incident would not be forgotten, and that I would later use every piece of recorded evidence to defend my right to live on my terms. The day's events had transformed from a minor inconvenience into a beacon of resistance against petty tyranny, and I vowed to stand up for fairness, not just for myself, but for everyone in Pleasantview who had been pushed around by the very rules meant to protect us. Part 4, almost equals 700 words. Documenting the incident and preparing for the town hall later that day, after the confrontation with Caroline had been diffused by Officer Mitchell's intervention, I returned to my house feeling a mix of frustration and determination. I, Ethan Carter, knew that if someone could so boldly misuse emergency services over a trivial issue, then I had to take further steps to document every detail. Once inside, I immediately transferred the video recordings from my phone onto my computer, reviewing each clip carefully. I wanted every moment, the exact time of the sirens, the officer's calm demeanor, and especially Caroline's theatrics, to be preserved as evidence of the injustice unfolding. I began writing a detailed account of the incident. I noted that while I was washing my car, a routine, even therapeutic, act, Caroline had rolled up in her immaculate white SUV. There was a theatrical quality to her entire approach. From the way she emerged on her porch to her exaggerated proclamation that my lawn violated a specific section of the HOA rules. I recorded every exchange, carefully noting her insults and the ironic claim that I was refusing to fix what she deemed an unkept lawn. To me, it was clear that her actions were less about maintaining community standards and more about asserting control over every minor detail of our lives. Once I had compiled my narrative, I sat down with my wife, Samantha Carter. We discussed the broader implications. In a town that prided itself on order and symmetry, did we really want someone like Caroline dictating what was acceptable and what was not? Samantha's gentle encouragement reminded me that my duty wasn't just to defend my own rights as a property owner, but to stand for fairness in Pleasantview. We resolved together that if this injustice continued, we would not remain silent. Determined to take action, I then delved into the local municipal codes and the HOA bylaws. I discovered numerous clauses that guaranteed homeowners the right to manage their own property without interference. I highlighted and printed these sections, then cross-referenced them with my notes from the incident. The evidence was overwhelming. No rule justified calling 911 over a car wash, and certainly not when it resulted in a humiliating spectacle for a police chief. I added these documents to my growing folder of evidence. But I didn't stop there. I began interviewing several neighbors in Pleasantview. In quiet voices at the local diner, people recounted similar run-ins with Caroline. One elderly man, who'd experienced fining over a misplaced flower pot, confided that he'd lived in constant fear of her justice. A woman named Mrs. Everett even mentioned that she had once been berated for the color of her mailbox. The recurring theme was clear. Caroline wasn't interested in genuine community welfare, she was using the power entrusted to her to serve her own agenda. Motivated by these testimonies, I drafted an outline for a town hall meeting. My idea was to present the collective grievances and my documented evidence to the HOA board. This was not an attempt to seek revenge, but rather to restore a spirit of transparency and fairness to the neighborhood. I even prepared a short presentation that would include photographs from my video, copies of the police report, and excerpts from the relevant HOA rules. In the meantime, Officer Mitchell's brief intervention had left a bitter taste in my mouth. Though he had done his duty, the fact that the department had been forced to respond to such a trivial call highlighted a system abused by petty tyranny. I included in my dossier a transcript of the conversation with Officer Mitchell, emphasizing how misused emergency services could be redirected from real crises. That night, as I sat on my back porch with Samantha, the cool air offered little comfort compared to the fire that had been lit inside me. I resolved to attend the next HOA meeting prepared. I was determined that the matter would no longer be swept under the rug by outdated policies and the unchecked power of one overzealous individual. I closed my laptop with a sense of purpose. Tomorrow, armed with compelling evidence and a clear plan, I would challenge the status quo at the town hall. It wasn't just about me or my car wash anymore, it was about reclaiming a community from the oppressive grip of a misguided enforcer. And I was ready to be the catalyst that sparked real, positive change in Pleasantview. Part 5, almost equals 700 words, the tipping point, preparing and going public. The atmosphere in Pleasantview had reached a boiling point. In the wake of my confrontation with Caroline Westwood, the indignation of the community was palpable. I, Ethan Carter, spent the next few days meticulously organizing all the evidence. Every detail, from the audio recording of Officer Mitchell's remarks to the video footage capturing Caroline's outlandish claims, was compiled into a comprehensive dossier. I wanted to ensure that if Caroline tried to twist the narrative further, there would be an undeniable record of her actions. I began by creating a digital folder labeled Community Standards and Evidence. Inside were scans of the relevant HOA bylaws, particularly the sections that guaranteed homeowners rights over their property. I annotated the documents with my personal notes on how Caroline's behavior had blatantly violated these rules. I also extracted the audio of the officer's statement, noting the precise language used and the moment when he requested my identification. Every piece of information, no matter how small, formed a mosaic of injustice. As I sifted through all the evidence, I recalled overhearing several neighbors whisper about past transgressions. It turned out that Caroline's reign of petty tyranny wasn't an isolated case, others had silently suffered under her rule. A local retiree, Mr. Landry, had once confided that he'd been fined for a minor infraction that he couldn't even remember. A young mother, Mrs. Delgado, lamented how Caroline's constant surveillance made her feel unsafe in her own home. These accounts, though fragmented, confirmed that the problem was systemic. Emboldened by this collective experience, I decided it was time to take the next step, going public. I reached out to a local online forum where residents of Pleasantview often discussed neighborhood issues. There, I posted an update, carefully detailing the incident, my interactions with Officer Mitchell, and, most importantly, Caroline's blatant misuse of the 911 emergency line. I attached snippets of audio and still images from my recordings. The moment her face changed color when she heard my identification and her furious claim that I was blocking access. The post was crafted with a balanced tone, emphasizing that my goal was to restore fairness and community trust, not to incite vengeance. The response was swift and overwhelming. Residents poured in with support, recounting their own grievances and sharing additional evidence of similar behavior by Caroline. One comment from a user who identified as a former HOA board member read, "I've seen this before. It's time we hold her accountable for abusing her power." Others chimed in with heartfelt accounts of living under constant pressure, a pressure that had transformed Pleasantview into a place of fear rather than fellowship. Encouraged by this solidarity, I began reaching out to a few key figures in the community. I set up informal meetings over coffee with several longtime residents who had also experienced Caroline's overbearing oversight. In these gatherings, we discussed forming a formal petition to present at the next HOA meeting. I took detailed notes on every suggestion and compiled additional evidence that some neighbors provided via email and text messages. Every instance reinforced the notion that Caroline's authority was built on arbitrary and, in some cases, discriminatory practices. Meanwhile, I also contacted Officer Mitchell to request a copy of the police report. Although the report simply noted that the 911 call had been a false alarm, the way it was documented would serve as an official record supporting my claims. I added a scanned copy of the report to my folder. That evening, as the community's outcry began to echo in local social media posts and heated discussions in online groups, I felt a surge of determination. I wasn't just fighting for my right to wash my car without interruption, I was standing up for every resident of Pleasantview who had endured Caroline's oppressive tactics. I spent hours drafting a formal letter addressed to the HOA board, urging them to review Caroline's conduct and to reconsider the rules that allowed such behavior. I argued that real community standards should promote mutual respect rather than a rigid, punitive code that punished normal behavior. My letter, backed by comprehensive evidence and the support of many neighbors, was designed to be an inflection point, a clear, decisive moment when the voice of the people could not be ignored. As I finally saved the final version of my letter and prepared to send it off in the morning, I felt a profound sense of purpose. This was more than a personal battle. It was a fight for justice, unity, and the reclaiming of our neighborhood from tyranny. The tipping point had arrived, and I vowed that Pleasantview would never again be held captive by an overzealous enforcer whose idea of perfection left no room for human imperfection. Part 6, almost equals 700 words, the turnaround, community reaction and rising tensions in the wake of my public posting and the formal letter to the HOA board. The atmosphere in Pleasantview took on a charged, almost revolutionary tone. I, Ethan Carter, noticed that the tone of conversations throughout our cul-de-sac had shifted dramatically. Neighbors, once timid in their criticisms, now spoke freely about the tyranny of a certain overbearing HOA enforcer, Caroline Westwood. Every whispered complaint and every side glance confirmed that my message had resonated deeply. Early one morning, as I stepped out to take my usual walk, I saw small groups of residents huddled together near mailboxes and driveways, animatedly discussing the recent developments. Some recounted similar experiences. One woman described how Caroline had fined her for a slightly crooked mailbox, while another shared a story of being harassed for leaving a stray flower untended. It seemed that for years, a quiet revolution had been simmering beneath the manicured surface of Pleasantview. At the local coffee shop, I sat with Mr. Landry and Mrs. Delgado, two longtime residents whose previously hushed voices now rang with conviction. Mr. Landry confided, "We've been living under her thumb for too long. I never thought anyone would stand up and fight back." Mrs. Delgado, ever the empathetic soul, nodded vigorously. Their stories, combined with the evidence I had compiled, painted a damning picture of Caroline's unchecked power. Conversations swirled around about how the rules were manipulated to serve her personal vendetta rather than the good of the community. Spurred on by these discussions, I began to see opportunities for organized action. I set up a meeting in the local community center, inviting anyone who had been affected by Caroline's reign. The turnout was unexpectedly high, dozens of residents, many of them who had silently endured fines and demeaning encounters, filled the room. The meeting buzzed with the energy of collective frustration and hope. I presented my digital dossier once again, this time in a more public forum. Projecting photos, audio clips, and excerpts from my formal letter to the HOA, I made a compelling case that the established rules were being misused as a tool for personal vendetta. Throughout the lengthy meeting, debates ensued. Some argued that Caroline was simply upholding standards, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The consensus emerged that while maintaining order was essential, it should not come at the cost of basic respect and fairness. I could sense that the residents were ready to reclaim control of their neighborhood, a sentiment that filled me with both pride and a sense of solemn responsibility. That same day, I also received a few texts from supporters on the local online forum, praising my courage and asking for further updates on the plan to present our case at the next HOA meeting. I responded with detailed outlines of what we could do next, collect additional testimonies, draft a petition, and even engage a neutral mediator for future disputes. Between organizing the community and continuing my own research on local ordinances, I found that the issue had grown beyond just one incident. It had become a symbol of resistance against arbitrary control. I spent the late afternoon holed up in my office reviewing the minutes from previous HOA meetings. Minutes that often glossed over complaints with generic assurances and empty promises. The contrast between that complacency and our current outcry was stark, and it only further justified our stand. By evening, as I looked around Pleasantview, I noticed a tangible shift. The once passive neighborhood was buzzing with a new sense of empowerment. Local residents were discussing improvements to community governance, ensuring that future decisions would be made transparently and collaboratively. The oppressive grip that Caroline had long held was gradually loosening, replaced by a collective determination to reassert our rights. As the day ended, I returned home exhausted but hopeful. I updated my digital dossier with all the new testimonies and prepared a summary to share with the HOA board. I resolved that our next step would be to present a united front at an emergency HOA meeting, a meeting that, if successful, would transform Pleasantview's future. That night, sitting with Samantha at our kitchen table while the neighborhood lights flickered on, I felt a profound sense of purpose. We were no longer isolated individuals facing arbitrary power, we were a community, ready to stand together and demand justice. The battle was far from over, but I was confident that our collective action would pave the way for a fairer, more respectful Pleasantview. Part 7, almost equals 700 words, the HOA meeting. Exposing the tyrant. The day of the emergency HOA meeting arrived with palpable tension hanging in the air. I, Ethan Carter, arrived early at the community center, a modest building that had long served as the heart of Pleasantview's gatherings. In the lobby, I saw familiar faces, neighbors who had quietly suffered under the oppressive oversight of Caroline Westwood, the notorious HOA enforcer. Today, they appeared determined, their eyes held hope. Inside the meeting room, rows of chairs faced a simple podium where the HOA board members sat, their expressions a mix of apprehension and curiosity. As the meeting was called to order, a hushed silence descended over the room. I took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium, my digital dossier secured at hand. Good evening, I began, my voice steady. I stand before you not just as a homeowner but as a representative of all of us who believe in fairness and transparency. I then recounted the events that had led us here, starting with a seemingly trivial Saturday where I was washing my car, only to be targeted by Caroline Westwood for failing to meet an arbitrary standard of lawn perfection. I described in detail how Caroline had escalated the matter, calling 911 on me, and the subsequent arrival of Officer Mitchell, now referred to in our narrative as Officer Mitchell, who, after verifying my identification, found nothing amiss. As I walked the room through a series of photographs and audio excerpts from my recordings, I reminded everyone of the cornerstone of homeowner rights, the freedom to manage one's own property without unwarranted interference. I displayed clear images of my well-maintained driveway and the impeccable condition of my property, juxtaposed with Caroline's aggressive and intrusive behavior. A murmur of approval rippled through the audience. I then presented the official HOA correspondence that I had received, a series of obscure, official letters that cited an obscure section of the HOA handbook, demanding perfection and punishing even the mildest deviation. I emphasized that while rules exist for a reason, they should not be weaponized to enforce a repressive, homogeneous standard that stifles individual expression. Caroline, seated near the front, listened with her face set in a mask of barely contained fury. When I concluded my presentation, there was a heavy silence before one of the board members, Mrs. Clarkson, timidly asked for clarification on the exact regulation that I had allegedly violated. I referred them to the HOA bylaws, pointing out the language that clearly emphasized reasonable maintenance rather than obsessive control. At that moment, Caroline stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is all a misunderstanding," she shouted, her voice trembling with indignation. "I have been enforcing the standards for the good of our community, and if my actions are deemed proper, then who am I to complain?" Her words were met with a mixture of gasps and murmurs from the audience. A brave resident, Mr. Fletcher, rose to speak next. "I've lived here for 25 years, he said quietly, "and I've seen enough arbitrary fines and petty complaints to last a lifetime. It's time we demand accountability from those who abuse their power." His measured tone inspired several others to speak up, recounting their own experiences with unwarranted harassment by Caroline. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that the collective sentiment was one of outrage against authoritarian overreach. Several board members acknowledged that previous practices had allowed Caroline too much discretion, and one even mentioned that there were rumors of misappropriated funds for personal expenses, a claim that further eroded her credibility. By the end of the meeting, a vote was taken. With nearly every voice in favor, the board unanimously resolved to remove Caroline Westwood from her position as head of the HOA. The decision was met with a mixture of relief and applause. For the first time in many years, the residents of Pleasantview felt that they had reclaimed control of their community. After the meeting, as people milled about in small groups discussing the events, I received countless expressions of gratitude and support. "You've given us our voices back, Ethan," one resident told me. "Now we can finally live without fear of petty tyranny." Even as Caroline's departure loomed over her, the mood in the room was resolute and optimistic. Leaving the community center that day, I felt a sense of both exhaustion and triumph. The confrontation had been public, raw, and deeply personal for many. It wasn't merely about a car wash or a well-manicured lawn, it was about restoring dignity to our everyday lives. And as I walked back to my car, I knew that although the road ahead might bring further challenges, this decisive moment had forever altered the power dynamics in Pleasantview. Part 8, almost equals 500 words, Aftermath and Community Reformation. In the weeks following the pivotal HOA meeting, the winds of change swept through Pleasantview. The removal of Caroline Westwood from the HOA leadership marked the beginning of a new era in our once troubled neighborhood. I, Ethan Carter, observed firsthand how the decision galvanized residents and spurred meaningful reforms in community governance. Newly elected board members, committed to transparency and fairness, began reviewing long-standing policies that had once allowed for unchecked authoritarianism. Outdated rules, many of which had been weaponized by Caroline, were scrapped or significantly revised. The atmosphere in Pleasantview transformed gradually, as residents began speaking more openly and amicably about local issues without the fear of being targeted. I noticed small but symbolic changes almost immediately. Neighbors who had once exchanged furtive glances and hushed whispers now greeted each other with warm smiles. Our community meetings, which had been laden with tension and suspicion, became venues for constructive dialogue. At one such meeting, a new board member passionately declared that the community's strength lay in its diversity and individual freedoms rather than in rigid conformity. The sentiment resonated deeply throughout Pleasantview, and a sense of renewed unity took root. On a personal level, I found solace in the knowledge that speaking up for my rights had not only vindicated me but also sparked collective empowerment. My driveway and my meticulously maintained property, once symbols of a personal routine marred by bureaucratic overreach, had become emblems of resistance. I even started a small neighborhood newsletter, sharing stories of everyday victories against petty abuses of power. Throughout the community, there were subtle signs that life was returning to a state of balance. Landscaping rules were enforced with a sense of reason rather than obsession, and the dreaded fear of an overzealous enforcer had receded from daily conversations. Even local businesses, which had suffered under the weight of oppressive regulations, began to thrive again, buoyed by the revival of a more free-spirited atmosphere. For me, the change was bittersweet. While I felt relieved that the tyranny of a single Karen was no longer dictating our community's norms, I also recognized the cost of the ordeal. The emotional toll, the divisions it had sown among neighbors, and the arduous battle to reclaim our rights lingered as sobering reminders. Yet, every time I stepped outside and saw Pleasantview bustling with genuine camaraderie, I knew that our collective efforts had been worth it. As dusk fell on a crisp autumn evening, I sat on my porch and reflected on the remarkable transformation. The scars of the past were slowly healing, replaced by a shared commitment to fairness and mutual respect. Though the memory of that chaotic day would never completely vanish, it now served as a powerful lesson. That the courage to speak up and stand together can fundamentally change a community for the better. Part 9, almost equals 500 words, personal reflection and lingering impact. In the months after the dramatic upheaval, life in Pleasantview settled into a new normal, one markedly different from the oppressive atmosphere we had known under Caroline Westwood's regime. I, Ethan Carter, found myself frequently reflecting on the turbulence that had rocked our community and on the personal journey that began with a simple car wash incident. The local media continued to discuss the saga, with headlines lauding the community for reclaiming its voice against petty tyranny. I received messages of gratitude and even a few congratulatory calls from longtime residents who admitted they had long harbored silent grievances. These expressions of support were both heartwarming and humbling, and they reinforced my belief that standing up for one's rights can trigger a much-needed renaissance in even the most subdued neighborhoods. On a personal level, I learned that bravery isn't always about grand gestures, it's often found in the willingness to document the truth and hold a mirror up to injustice. I kept my digital dossier as a testament to the ordeal. Every audio clip, photograph, and handwritten note served as a reminder of the day when an overzealous enforcer turned a routine act into a public debacle. And while the excitement of the media attention eventually waned, the lasting impact on the community remained palpable. People began to question long-entrenched rules and to demand that regulations serve to enhance, rather than stifle, our daily lives. Even my own perspective shifted. I became more vigilant about my rights as a homeowner, making it a point to attend HOA meetings and to participate actively in discussions about community policies. I also started to engage in conversations with neighbors, encouraging them to share their own experiences and to advocate for fairness in every facet of life. Slowly but surely, Pleasantview became a place where people felt empowered to speak out against injustice, and where small, individual acts of defiance accumulated into significant social change. Despite the many positives, there were moments of introspection about the personal toll of the entire episode. I sometimes questioned whether exposing Caroline's abuse of power was the right course, as the ordeal had also drawn unwanted attention and subtle whispers that followed me wherever I went. Yet, even these doubts were outweighed by the overwhelming sense of vindication and renewal that had since taken hold. As I sat on my porch one cool evening, watching the sunset and the quiet bustle of neighbors who now treated one another with genuine warmth, I realized that the battle had reshaped more than just local policies, it had reawakened the spirit of community. The painful memories of that turbulent time had given way to a newfound optimism, reminding everyone that even the smallest actions, like a car wash, can serve as the catalyst for profound change. Part 10, almost equals 500 words, resolution and future hope. In the final days following the upheaval, Pleasantview emerged transformed, and the ripple effects of our collective action began to solidify. I, Ethan Carter, found that the once oppressive environment had given way to a more vibrant, inclusive community, one that now embraced openness and fairness over rigid control. The new HOA board wasted no time in overhauling outdated policies. Regulations that once seemed designed solely to empower an overzealous enforcer were revised and replaced with rules that reflected the residents' true needs. Town hall meetings grew more participatory, and community events became platforms for dialogue and mutual support. This renaissance in Pleasantview signified that our actions had not only exposed the abuses of power but had also set the stage for lasting reform. On a personal level, I took pride in the role I inadvertently played in reshaping our community. My once quiet routine, washing my car on a sunny Saturday, had transformed into a symbol of resistance against arbitrary authority. My red car, gleaming under the afternoon sun, came to represent not just cleanliness, but the freedom to manage my property as I saw fit. I even installed a small plaque in my driveway reading, "Our property, our rights," a daily reminder of our hard-won victory. The story of our neighborhood upheaval quickly became a local legend. It was discussed in cafes, at community centers, and even made an appearance in the local newspaper under headlines like, "Suburban Rebellion, One Man's Stand Against Tyranny." I found that my experience resonated with many who had long chafed under the weight of excessive regulation. In time, I received invitations to speak at community forums about the importance of civic engagement and protecting homeowner rights, a responsibility I accepted with a mix of humility and determination. Yet, as the dust settled, I couldn't ignore the bittersweet nature of what had transpired. The dramatic downfall of Caroline Westwood, the once formidable HOA enforcer, had come at a cost. Relationships in Pleasantview had been strained, and the confrontation had unearthed underlying tensions that would require time to heal fully. However, the overwhelming public support for fairness and transparency outweighed the pain of disruption. Many residents expressed relief at having their voices heard and the oppressive practices dismantled. Now, as I sit on my porch, watching the soft glow of twilight and the gentle hum of neighborhood life, I feel a surge of hope for the future. Pleasantview has learned a valuable lesson, that no one should be allowed to dictate every minutiae of personal life in the name of community order. With renewed policies and a spirit of unity, our town is poised to flourish under the principles of respect and equality. I, Ethan Carter, close this chapter with gratitude for the resilience of our community and a quiet optimism for what lies ahead. May our example serve as a reminder that even the smallest act, a car wash, a locked shed, or a stand against tyranny, can ignite a movement that transforms lives for the better.